Ezekiel Hull had grown used to silence. It lived in the beams of his ranch house and slept in the corners where lamplight never quite reached. It rode the wind across the Wyoming plains and settled heavy on his shoulders at dusk. Since returning from war, silence had been his closest companion, steadier than men, kinder than memory. Each morning he rose before dawn. He fed the horses, he mended fence, he split wood until his palms stung beneath old scars. The land did not argue, it did not judge, it simply endured, and so did he. The ranch house stood alone against a wide stretch of prairie, its porch bleached pale by sun and winter storms. Inside, the long wooden table bore knife marks from years past. One chair, one tin cup, one plate set down each night. Until the letter came. It arrived folded and creased, carried in by a passing rider who did not linger. Ezekiel stood by the doorway as he opened it, gray eyes scanning handwriting he recognized at once. Jeremiah Clark. An old comrade, a man who had traded rifle smoke for a preacher's collar in Kansas. Ezekiel read slowly. Jeremiah did not waste ink. He wrote of a woman named Miriam Hayes, a widow, a woman left with more whispers than shelter, a woman spoken about more than spoken to. She has known hardship, Jeremiah's letter said, more than most. She is quiet, but not weak. If anyone deserves a chance to begin again, it is her. And if anyone is steady enough to offer it, it is you. Ezekiel lowered the paper. A woman. Coming here. To this house, where no laughter had sounded in years. His jaw tightened slightly. He had not asked for company, had not imagined himself fit to guide anyone through the lonely stretch of his life. The war had carved pieces from him he never reclaimed. What remained was steady, but worn. Yet Jeremiah had never been a foolish man. Ezekiel folded the letter once more and set it on the table. His gaze moved slowly across the room. Bare walls, no curtains, dust gathering along the window frame. If she came, she would find no softness here, but she would find no cruelty either. That evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, Ezekiel stepped outside and looked across the fields. The wind moved through the grass in long silver waves. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel complete. It felt as though it were waiting. 2 days later, the stagecoach appeared as a distant rattle on the road. Miriam Hayes sat inside, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The journey had been long, the road uneven beneath iron wheels. With each jolt, memories threatened to rise. The small house she had left behind, the sharp laughter of those who pitied her too loudly, the cold stares that followed her down church aisles. Widow, burden, unwanted. She had learned to lower her eyes before anyone could lower them for her. Her reflection in the small coach window wavered with movement. She saw a dark-skinned woman with soft, rounded cheeks and a full figure that no dress could hide. Her curves often drew criticism before kindness. She had been told more than once that a woman built like her ought to shrink herself small, but she had never known how. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the wheels slowed. When the wheels finally stilled, the driver stepped down first and unloaded her trunk without ceremony. Dust swirled in the wind as he climbed back up again, tipping his hat briefly before urging the horses forward again. Then she was alone. Before her stood the ranch house, plain wood weathered pale, porch boards creaking softly in the breeze. Beyond it, endless land stretched beneath a wide sky. The door opened. Ezekiel Hull stepped out. Tall, broad across the shoulders, his hair streaked gray at the temples, face cut with lines earned honestly. His eyes, cool, ash-colored, studied her without haste. Miriam felt her breath catch. She had imagined a man hardened beyond approach, perhaps sharp, perhaps indifferent. Instead, she saw restraint. He did not smile, but neither did he frown. They stood facing one another in the yard, wind moving between them. She became acutely aware of her size beneath his gaze, not small, not delicate. Her brown dress fit snug across her hips, her curves strong and unapologetic beneath the fabric. For a fleeting second, doubt pricked her chest. Had he expected someone else? A smaller woman? A quieter presence? The wind rose suddenly, catching her shawl and pulling it from her shoulders. She stumbled slightly as she reached to grab it. Ezekiel's hand moved before she could. His palm closed around hers to steady her. Warm, solid. The contact startled them both. Miriam's heart leapt against her ribs. She was used to touch that demanded, touch that bruised. This was neither. It was steady. He released her at once, stepping back half a pace. "I'll take that," he said, lifting her trunk as if it were no heavier than a saddle. His voice was rough but even. She nodded, unable to form more than a soft, "Thank you." Inside, the house felt large and spare. Her eyes moved over the scarred table, the unadorned walls, the single shelf holding dried goods. There were no flowers, no curtains softening the light. But there were no broken plates, no lingering scent of anger. Ezekiel set her trunk near the hallway. "Mother's room?" he said quietly, gesturing down the corridor. Miriam stepped inside the small bedroom. A narrow bed stood beneath a window overlooking open grassland. A quilt lay folded neatly on top, worn but clean. She touched it gently. No one had prepared a space for her before. When she returned to the main room, Ezekiel was lighting the hearth. At supper, he placed a second spoon beside her without comment. The gesture was simple, but to Miriam it felt monumental. They ate in silence. The clink of metal against tin echoed softly. Once, he nudged the plate of meat slightly closer to her. "Eat more," he said, not looking up. She swallowed and nodded. Across the table, their eyes met briefly. Not strangers, not yet familiar, but something unspoken settled between them, a quiet understanding that neither had come seeking romance. They had come seeking refuge. That night, as Miriam lay beneath the quilt in her new room, she listened to the wind outside. It did not carry shouting. It did not carry threat. Only open sky. And somewhere in the house, the faint sound of a man sitting awake beside a dying fire, steady as the land itself.
Morning came gently to the home ranch, pale light stretching across the prairie before slipping through the narrow kitchen window. Miriam was awake before the sun fully rose. Old habits did not loosen easily. She moved quietly from her small bedroom, careful not to disturb the silence that still felt borrowed rather than owned. The wooden floor was cool beneath her feet. She tied her shawl around her shoulders and knelt before the hearth, coaxing yesterday's embers back to life. Fire answered her patience. Soon warmth began to spread through the room. Miriam moved with a natural steadiness despite the fullness of her frame. Her hips brushed the edge of the table as she reached for the flour tin, and the fabric of her dress curved generously around her waist and thighs. She had spent years shrinking her movements, attempting to take up less space than she did. But here, in this house, no one sighed when she passed. No one told her to move aside.
She set water to boil and began kneading dough, strong brown hands pressing and folding with quiet rhythm. From the doorway, Ezekiel watched. He had risen earlier than usual, uncertain why sleep had abandoned him before dawn. He stood there now, arms folded loosely across his chest, observing without speaking. He had expected fragility. Jeremiah's letter had described her as shy, but what he saw was not fragility, it was resilience. She worked without complaint, without asking permission. There was no hesitation in the way she lifted the cast-iron skillet or carried the water bucket. Her body was soft, yes, but strong beneath that softness, grounded. When she finally noticed him standing there, she startled slightly. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said, voice low. "You didn't," he replied. An awkward pause stretched between them. He stepped forward, reaching for the coffee tin. Their hands nearly brushed again. Miriam withdrew hers quickly, heat rising to her cheeks. She was not used to standing this close to a man without bracing herself. Ezekiel noticed the instinctive retreat. He said nothing. They ate breakfast at the long wooden table, bread still warm from her careful hands, coffee poured evenly between them. This time the silence did not feel as heavy. After the meal, Miriam gathered the plates before he could protest. "You don't have to," he began. "I don't mind," she said gently. He watched her rinse dishes at the basin, sleeves rolled slightly up her arms. Sunlight filtered through the window, catching in the curve of her cheek and the fullness of her figure as she leaned forward. Something unfamiliar stirred in him. Not desire, not yet. Awareness. Later that afternoon, Miriam wandered beyond the porch and found the small garden patch behind the house. It had been neglected, soil cracked from dry months and weeds rising where vegetables once grew. She knelt without hesitation. The earth stained her fingers dark. She pulled weeds carefully, one by one, loosening hardened soil with patient hands. Her skirt fanned around her, fabric stretching comfortably over her hips as she leaned forward to press new seeds into the ground. From the fence line, Ezekiel watched again. He leaned against a wooden post, arms crossed, hat tilted low over his eyes. He had not tended that garden since his mother passed. Seeing Miriam there, bent over the soil, determined yet unassuming, shifted something in him he had not examined in years. The land looked different with her in it, softer. That evening, he led one of the horses into the yard to reset the saddle straps. Miriam lingered nearby, brushing dirt from her hands. "Would you show me?" she asked quietly. He looked at her. At first he hesitated, but then he nodded. "Hold the reins like this." She stepped closer, her shoulder brushing lightly against his arm. Up close, he noticed the faint scent of soap and sun-warmed skin. She reached for the leather strap, fingers uncertain around its thickness. Ezekiel stepped behind her to guide her hands. His larger frame cast a shadow over her smaller one, though she was not small at all. Her back curved gently beneath her dress, the fullness of her form pressing subtly against the space between them. He swallowed. "Not so tight," he murmured. His hand covered hers briefly, adjusting her grip. Miriam's breath hitched. The contact was light, barely there, but enough to send a rush of memory through her body. Instinct made her tense. The reins slipped from her hands, striking the ground with a sharp snap. They both froze. Ezekiel stepped back immediately, palms lifting slightly as if to show he meant no harm. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, bending to retrieve the reins. "You have nothing to apologize for," he answered. Their eyes met. There was no accusation in his gaze, only restraint, only care. But something had changed. That night, Miriam sat by her bedroom window, looking out at the stretch of silver prairie beneath moonlight. She pressed her hand lightly to her chest. She had not meant to react so sharply, yet her body still remembered what her mind wished to forget. In the main room, Ezekiel sat near the dying fire. He stared at his hands. Hands that once held rifles, hands that knew violence, hands that had just brushed the fingers of a woman who flinched. He did not blame her. He blamed the world that had taught her to brace for harm. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. There was a new kind of silence growing between them, not distance, but caution. Two wounded souls learning the shape of one another's shadows. Neither spoke of it, yet when dawn came the next morning, Ezekiel was already hauling water before she stepped outside. And when Miriam reached for the heavy bucket, he simply said, "Let me." She hesitated, then released it into his hands. A small gesture, but for Miriam, it was the first time in years she had allowed a man to carry weight for her without fear of what it might cost. And for Ezekiel, it was the first time he carried something not out of duty, but out of quiet choice.
The storm announced itself in the afternoon sky. By noon, the horizon had turned the color of iron. Wind moved low across the prairie, bending grass flat against the earth. Ezekiel stood near the barn, eyes narrowed toward the west. "Snow," he muttered under his breath. Inside the house, Miriam felt it too, the strange heaviness in the air before something breaks. She had just finished folding clean linens when the first sharp gust struck the side of the house, rattling the shutters. Within the hour, the blizzard descended in full fury. Wind screamed across the plains, hurling white sheets of snow against the windows. The porch disappeared behind a curtain of ice. Ezekiel moved quickly, driving the livestock into shelter, securing barn doors, reinforcing the latch across the front entrance. When he stepped back inside, snow clung to his shoulders and hat brim. "No one goes out," he said evenly, bolting the door tight. Miriam nodded from near the hearth. She had already stoked the fire high, flames leaping gold and amber against the wooden walls. The warmth battled the cold pressing from outside, but the sound of the storm seeped through every crack. She wrapped a thick blanket around her shoulders and sat on the rug before the hearth. Ezekiel removed his coat slowly and set it aside. He added another log to the fire before lowering himself across from her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the wind howled, and the fire answered with sharp cracks. The storm felt too loud, too close. Miriam's fingers tightened in the fabric of her blanket. Storms had once meant raised voices, meant bottles slamming against walls, meant nights where she stayed still and silent to avoid drawing attention. Her breathing grew shallow. Ezekiel noticed. "You're safe here," he said quietly, not looking directly at her. The words hung between them. Safe. She studied the flames, gathering courage she had not intended to summon. "Once," she began softly, "I thought I would never sit by a fire with a man again." Ezekiel's gaze lifted. Miriam swallowed. "My husband never struck my face, only where no one would see." Her voice did not tremble now. It carried the steadiness of someone who had endured and survived. "He called it discipline. I called it learning how not to make a sound." The wind roared against the walls as if protesting her confession. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. His hand, resting on his knee, curled slowly into a fist. "I held a rifle at 18. Thought I was brave," he said, a voice rougher than usual. "But the things I saw, the things I did, they follow me still." Miriam looked at him fully now. He was not a man easily shaken, yet something vulnerable flickered in his gray eyes. "I came back from war, but part of me never left." The fire snapped sharply between them. Outside, snow lashed harder. Inside, the space between them shifted. "Perhaps," Miriam whispered, "we both carry wounds no one can see." Their eyes met. Longer this time, not as strangers, not as two people merely sharing a roof, but as equals.
The storm pressed closer, and a sudden crack of thunder made Miriam flinch before she could stop herself. Ezekiel moved without thinking. He shifted closer across the rug, not touching her yet, but near enough that warmth from his body reached her through the blanket. She stilled. He spoke carefully, as if each word required deliberate placement. "Miriam, if you'll allow it, I would like you to feel safe here, with me." The simplicity of it undid her more than any grand declaration could have. She hesitated only a moment before giving a small nod. Slowly, cautiously, Ezekiel reached for her hand. His palm hovered first, giving her space to refuse. When she did not pull away, he let his rough fingers close gently around hers. Her skin was warm, soft. Her hand was smaller than his, but steady. He felt the faint tremble beneath her calm exterior, and something inside him shifted sharply. She was not fragile. She was brave. The storm raged harder, but neither noticed it as keenly now. "I was told," she began quietly, eyes lowered, "that no man would ever want a woman built like me." The words seemed torn from someplace deep. Ezekiel's brow furrowed. She kept speaking, voice steady but heavy. "Too much, too dark, too large. I was told a woman like me should be grateful for any roof at all." Silence fell heavy between them. Ezekiel looked at her fully. Firelight traced the curve of her cheek, the fullness of her shoulders beneath the blanket, the softness of her waist where fabric gathered. There was strength there, presence, warmth. His hands began to shake, not from fear, from something else. Reverence. "Whoever told you that," he said slowly, voice thick with restrained emotion, "lied." She lifted her eyes to him, uncertain. He raised his free hand, hesitant at first, and brushed his knuckles gently along her cheek. "You are beautiful." The words settled between them like something sacred. Miriam's breath caught. No one had ever spoken that word to her with condition. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. Outside, the wind battered the house. Inside, something steadier took root. Ezekiel pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders, then carefully drew her into his chest. She stiffened for a brief heartbeat, then softened. Her head rested against him. She could hear the strong, steady rhythm of his heart beneath his shirt. His arm wrapped around her, not possessive, not demanding, protective. His hands trembled still as they rested at her back, not from desire alone, but from the realization that she trusted him. That night, beneath storm and firelight, they did not rush. They did not speak of tomorrow. They simply held one another. Miriam closed her eyes, listening to the storm fade into distant noise. And Ezekiel Whole, white cowboy hardened by war and loneliness, felt his hands shake until dawn, not from violence, not from rage, but from the fragile, powerful weight of holding a woman who had chosen to believe him when he said she was safe.
Spring arrived slowly over the Wyoming plains. Snow thinned into wet patches along the fence lines, and stubborn green shoots began pressing through thawed earth. The air no longer cut like a blade. Instead, it carried the promise of something new. At the Hall Ranch, change had already taken root. Miriam moved through the house with a quiet confidence that had not been there when she first arrived. She no longer hesitated before stepping into a room. Her laughter, soft but real, sometimes drifted from the kitchen when Ezekiel fumbled with flour or burned biscuits beyond saving. The house felt lived in now, lighter. But peace rarely settles without being tested. The sound of hooves broke the afternoon calm. Miriam stood on the porch rail shaking out a blanket when she heard it, a sharp, deliberate rhythm against hard ground.
Her hands stilled. Ezekiel emerged from the barn at the same moment, wiping his palms against his trousers as he narrowed his gaze toward the road. A rider approached fast. As the horse drew closer, recognition struck Miriam like a sudden chill. Thomas Reed, cousin to her late husband. He rode with arrogance carved into his posture, dark coat snapping behind him in the wind. His face had not softened with time. If anything, bitterness had sharpened it. He dismounted slowly, boots striking dirt with controlled force. "Well now," he drawled, eyes sweeping over the ranch before settling on Miriam. "Here'd tell you'd set yourself up proper." Miriam's spine stiffened, though she did not retreat immediately. Ezekiel stepped forward without being asked. "What business do you have here?" he asked, evenly. Thomas smirked, ignoring him. "Miriam Hayes, living bold on a white man's land. Didn't expect you'd climb so high." The words dripped with mockery. Miriam felt old fear claw at her ribs. The suffocating rooms of her former life flickered at the edges of memory, the whispered warnings that she should know her place. Her fingers tightened around the porch rail. "She is not yours to address that way," Ezekiel said, calmly. Thomas turned his head slowly, measuring him. "And who are you to say? You know what she was, what she comes from?" Ezekiel did not raise his voice. "I know what she is," he replied. Thomas laughed sharply. "You think a widow like her can outrun the Reed name? She was bound to that family." Miriam stepped back slightly, breath shallow. The implication was clear: ownership, claim. But something had changed in her since arriving here. She was no longer alone. Ezekiel moved, placing himself fully between Thomas and the porch. "She belongs to no man who thinks he owns her," he said, voice low but unmistakably firm. Thomas's jaw tightened. "You'll regret meddling in matters you don't understand." Ezekiel's hand rested near his holster, not drawing, not threatening, just steady. "I understand enough." Silence stretched tight between the men. The wind shifted across the yard, lifting dust at their boots. Thomas's eyes flicked back to Miriam, searching for weakness. But though her heart pounded, she did not lower her gaze this time. "You don't get to remind me of chains," she said, quietly, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I broke them." Thomas's expression hardened. "You think this ranch makes you equal?" he sneered. "No," she answered softly. "It makes me free." The words seemed to echo louder than she intended. Ezekiel did not look at her, but pride flickered in his eyes. Thomas studied the pair of them, measuring resolve, weighing odds. He was not a brave man without advantage. Finally, he spat into the dirt. "This won't end tidy," he muttered, mounting his horse again. "Shadows follow women like you." Ezekiel stepped forward just enough that the message carried clear, then let them follow at a distance. Thomas hesitated one last moment before jerking the reins and riding away, dust trailing behind him. The yard fell quiet again, but the tension did not vanish so easily. Miriam's knees weakened once the threat retreated from sight. She reached for the porch post, steadying herself. Ezekiel turned toward her slowly. "He won't return," he said. She searched his face. "You can't promise that." "No," he admitted, "but I can promise this." He stepped closer, not invading her space, but close enough that she felt the warmth of him. "You are not alone in facing whatever comes." Her throat tightened. For years, no one had stood between her and a raised voice. No one had met hostility with calm defense. She looked down briefly, then back up at him. "They always said I should be grateful for what little I was given," she murmured. Ezekiel shook his head once. "You were never meant for scraps." The wind softened. Spring sunlight filtered through thin clouds, casting faint gold across the fields. Miriam felt something settle inside her, not fear, not defiance, security. She had not known how deeply she craved it until this moment. Without speaking further, Ezekiel reached for her hand. This time, she did not flinch. Their fingers intertwined naturally, no hesitation between them. The ranch stood behind them, no longer empty, no longer haunted. Whatever storms followed, whether men or memories, they would not meet them separately. And for the first time since her husband's shadow had darkened her world, Miriam believed that freedom was not just distance from harm. It was standing in the open air beside someone who refused to let her bow her head again.
Summer arrived quietly over the Wyoming plains. The fields surrounding the whole ranch shimmered green beneath wide blue skies. Wildflowers pushed up along the fence lines, and the air carried warmth instead of warning. But inside the small ranch house, another season was unfolding, one of waiting. Miriam stood near the kitchen window, one hand resting over the gentle curve of her belly. She had told Ezekiel weeks ago. He had gone still when she spoke the words, "I think I'm with child." Now the truth showed plainly beneath her dress. Her once flat waist had rounded, her full figure softened further by life growing within her. She moved more slowly these days, careful with each step, though she refused to let herself be treated as fragile. Ezekiel watched her constantly, not with suspicion, with awe. He had known fear before, on battlefields and sleepless nights, but this was different. This fear carried hope inside it. He chopped wood more carefully, checked fences twice, reinforced the barn roof though no storm threatened. It was as if preparing the land could prepare him for fatherhood. One evening, he found Miriam seated on the porch, ankles swollen slightly, her hand moving in small circles across her stomach. He lowered himself beside her. "Is it troubling you?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, smiling faintly. "Just reminding me it's there." He hesitated before placing his large hand gently over hers. He felt it then, a small, undeniable movement beneath her skin. His breath caught. "That's our child," she whispered. His gray eyes glistened in the fading light. "Our child," he repeated softly, as if testing the shape of the words. For a man who once believed himself too damaged to build anything lasting, the idea felt almost too large to hold. Later that night, he knelt beside the bed, pressing his ear against her belly like a man listening for distant thunder. He heard nothing but her steady breathing. Still, he stayed there, as if proximity alone could protect them both. "I don't know how to be this," he admitted in a low voice. Miriam's fingers threaded through his hair gently. "You already are," she said. The birth came with the first breath of full summer. The morning sky had barely lightened when Miriam doubled over in pain near the kitchen table. Ezekiel was at her side instantly. Fear flashed across his face, raw and unguarded. The women from Willow Creek had been sent for weeks earlier, just in case. By midday, they arrived in a rush of skirts and steady hands. The house that once held only silence, now filled with murmured encouragement and urgent motion. Miriam gripped the edge of the bed, sweat beading along her brow. Her dark curls clung to her temples. Her strong body, so often judged unfairly, now labored with astonishing resilience. Ezekiel stayed beside her. He had faced gunfire without flinching, but this fight for life left him trembling. She cried out once, sharp and fierce. He tightened his grip on her hand. "I'm here," though the words felt too small. Hours blurred. Sunlight shifted across the wooden floor. And then, a cry split the air. High, clear, alive. The sound seemed to stop time itself. One of the women lifted the small wailing infant and placed her gently against Miriam's chest. "A girl," the whistmaid whispered. Miriam's exhausted eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the tiny face pressed against her skin. Dark hair already damp against a wrinkled forehead, small fists searching blindly for warmth. Ezekiel stood frozen. Then, slowly, almost reverently, he stepped closer.
He had held rifles, he had held dying men, but he had never held something so small. When the baby's fingers curled instinctively around his rough thumb, something inside him broke open completely. Tears slid down his weathered face without shame. "Miriam," he breathed, voice cracking. "She's perfect." Miriam looked up at him, weary but radiant. "She's ours." The words settled into him deeper than anything before. Ours. The days that followed were nothing like the silence he once knew. The house filled with new sounds, soft cries in the night, Miriam's gentle lullabies, the uneven rhythm of Ezekiel pacing the floor with his daughter against his chest. He fumbled with cloth diapers, nervous his large hands might do harm, but the baby quieted when he held her, as if she already knew the strength in him was no longer meant for destruction. Neighbors began leaving small gifts on the porch, milk, vegetables, hand-sewn blankets. The same town that once watched Miriam with curiosity now greeted her with warmth. She sat on the porch one evening, cradling her daughter against her full, protective frame. The sunset stretched gold across the horizon. Ezekiel joined her, settling beside her quietly. He studied the two of them, the woman sent to him shy and uncertain, and the child born of trust neither of them expected. "You were sent here," he said, after a long pause. Miriam glanced at him. He shook his head slightly, but not as charity, not as burden. His arm slid carefully around her shoulders. "You were sent here as my salvation." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. The prairie wind moved gently through the grass, no longer lonely. 3 shadows stretched across the porch in the fading light. Once the ranch had echoed with nothing but wind and memory. Now it held breath, heartbeat, hope. And as the sun dipped low, Ezekiel understood something with absolute clarity. The shy, black, plus-size bride who arrived with trembling hands had not come to be rescued. She had come to build something new. And in loving her, fully, fiercely, without shame, he had finally laid his own ghost to rest.